Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another wonderful evening of love, School of Love. Time for learning, a time for levity, time for remembering why we're here, and coming back to our center of center, the heart, place where we live and grow, receive and give from. I want to begin with a meditation. But before you close your eyes, it's actually a little bit different meditation that connects to our theme this evening. I want you to look around your room. Look around at the space that you're in, looking at different objects that are there, just making note of different things. And then close your eyes. Close your eyes and now remember the space. Recall the details. And feel from your heart how that space feels to you. With your eyes closed, again looking around the room, seeing it, feeling it, a sense of knowing the space. And then open your eyes again and have another look. Again, have a look around and look at other details. Note things in the space. Preparing to be able to recall, to reimagine. And again, close your eyes. Just going within, opening the inner eye to vision again what you were looking at. Now seeing it from the inside. Look at any of the details that you had seen with your physical eyes. See it with your inner eye. And feel the quality of those details with your heart perception. And see if there's anything that comes to mind as you recall the outer space, as you remember it, you feel it with your heart. Is there any details, any other information that comes to mind? And how good are you at reimagining something, revisioning it with the inner eye? Can you see the image of something that you looked at outwardly? Now we're going to let that go, and you're going to move into a room of your own creation. With your eyes closed, just imagining a marvelous room, something that feels really great to be in. It may contain elements of the room that you're in right now, but it might contain other things. What else comes into the space, third eye space, as you visualize the most marvelous room to be in? Could be palatial. Could be just a relaxed, casual style room. Feel it as you visualize it. And note how it's organized. How is it organized? How are things arranged in this room? Are there any objects placed in this marvelous imaginary space? Allow this space to hold you. Feel how it feels as it holds you, touches you inwardly. The qualities it fills you with inwardly. As you look out into this space that you have imagined and created. Is there any one particular detail that speaks to you, that touches you, warms your heart, opens your heart, makes your heart want to be open and to give and to share, to be connected to others? And feel how we are all connected. We're in different places outwardly, some in the loft, some in Zoom room, some on Facebook Live. But inwardly, we can be connected from that space of warmth and comfort in our hearts, connecting with others through that warmth. Feeling our unity, the power of our unity. And what a difference that makes to the world tonight. And I hope you're all feeling prepared for this evening. And I mean, really prepared. The reason I say that is because preparations have been going on for millennia for this moment. So really no excuse at this point. It is time to tap into what is already there, what has been prepared before, instead of wondering what to do, where to go, what to think, who to love, how to love, suffering from arrested development. No. Tonight, session 5 of this third series, and actually number 19 in this whole program of 21 sessions, we are coming into the home stretch of the School of Love. And it's time tonight to pull some of the big pieces together, get clear on how this crazy thing called life works, and where love fits into the equation, where love fits into the theory of everything, including love. What's almost as bad as no love is no knowing, not knowing. And most people I have met don't know how to know. They don't know how to know. And therefore, they really don't know love. They don't know how to love, who to love. But what we're going to make clear tonight is the connection between love and knowing. The relationship of love to knowledge. Have you ever noticed how both the quest for knowledge and the quest for love have been age-old quests. With regard to the quest for higher knowledge, of higher consciousness, we're going to see in this session how to achieve this is absolutely requires a higher love. Over the ages, people have sought to evoke altered states of consciousness through breathing techniques, Kundalini awakening, tantric sexual practices, ingestion of stimulants such as shamanistic use of plant spirit agents. But true knowing only comes by revelation from higher levels through the will of the Spirit. What that means is that sooner or later, we need to connect our will with the will of the Spirit. And that is where love comes in. But before we go there, let us recall from the previous session how we looked at the older paths as preparation for the new path. Older paths emphasize the diminution of the egoic self, rituals of humility, bowing, praying to an external God, use of substances to dissolve the self, the use of toxic substances such as intoxication as administered by temple workers was part of a practice to eject the ego out of the lower bodies, while the workers worked on the subtle energies of the aspirant. When the ego of the aspirant returned to the body, new imprints gave them a new and higher perception of reality. This is the way many of the older initiation rituals took place, while the person was unconscious and out of the body. Now, the new path requires that we make our initiation with our ego in our bodies, so we are conscious, participating in the process, and doing it through our
freedom of will.
Freedom of will. It's extremely important for people to understand this clearly, that the preparatory practices belong to a previous evolutionary stage of consciousness, and for the most part have fallen into decadent use in our times, even becoming a hazard to physical, mental, and spiritual health, even a distraction to the new way of working. Things have changed, and they're going to change even more. A new way has opened up that in some ways is the complete opposite of these older spiritual practices. And we need to be attentive to this, literally attending to the garden that has been prepared in the past, not letting the work of the past be undone or even overdone if we simply carry on with ancient lineages. We need to work with what our ancestors prepared in the past, not doing the same as them, but going on to the next stage of the plan, plant, planet. Part of the challenge is that we humans have had our higher senses possessed by our ancestors blunted by our modern lifestyles. So much in our environment is detrimental in some ways so that our senses are blunted. That's the bad news. The good news is that the development of the higher self is not so dependent on the outer environment, as is the lower self and our physical nature. The higher self is much more dependent on the inner environment, the inner room, you could say, we give it. This is why in the first series, I spoke extensively about the renewed mind from the epistles of the Apostle Paul, and how this is the key to power in overcoming the lower self stuff. The renewed mind is our power to create an ideal inner environment in which our higher self can germinate and grow. So in the quest for higher knowledge, if our senses do not allow us to perceive higher truths, what part of us is capable of perceiving higher truths? The higher self. I'm sure you guessed that right. So how do we get into our higher self? Or is the question the other way around? How do we get our higher self into us? This is central to this session entitled Grow Your Own I, Grow Your Own High. In the previous session, we looked at the seed-like nature of the higher self And we even did some meditating on seeds and some non-seeds to tune our sensitivity to the qualitative difference, and how that was already evoking some of the power of the higher self, our supersensible power, because the higher self is of a supersensible nature. We cannot see the higher self with the senses. We can only see the manifestation of it. But with our supersensible powers, we can see it, just as we could tune into the life of a seed or a plant with our sense of life, which is a supersensible power. Let me bring another quote from Rudolf Steiner. We need bear in mind that the higher self, which until now has lain dormant within us, seed-like and unconscious, is here born into conscious existence. This birth is not just an image. It is a literal birth in an absolutely real sense, a birth into the spiritual world. This quote from Steiner helps make clear a passage in the Gospel of John, where a man named Nicodemus came to Jesus to inquire about gaining spiritual knowledge. Jesus told him, "Nicodemus, you need to be born again in order to have access into spiritual things." Nicodemus responds, "How can someone be born again when they are old? Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born." Jesus answered, "No one has entry into the spiritual world unless born of water and of spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but spirit gives birth to spirit." So Jesus makes a distinction between our first birth, which was nothing we had anything to do with, and a second birth, a spiritual birth, one we need to be fully involved in, because that respects our freedom of will. Yes. Continuing with more from Rudolf Steiner, he says, "And if it is to be viable, the being that is born, the higher self, must enter this world with all its necessary organs and faculties. Just as nature must take care that infants are born and with fully formed eyes and ears, so the laws of our own development must ensure that our higher self begins its conscious existence equipped with all the faculties it needs." Here Steiner is speaking of very real things, faculties and organs that will act as instruments for our higher self, our spiritual self, to function in this world, but primarily the spiritual world. The higher self is not of a physical nature. It is a supersensible being beyond the senses, and yet it is meant to work through our physical nature and through our physical senses. But in addition to our lower nature and organs, our higher nature needs its own senses, its own faculties, its own organs, just as the physical body has its own organs. This, you could say, is like a higher octave of the lower self, with similarities, but also differences. In the previous session, I spoke of 12 senses, and we even worked with one of the higher senses, the sense of life, which is a supersensible sense, which enables us to sense things of a supersensible nature. And we did the Steiner contemplation of the seed practice, which allowed us to sense the life of the seed, something that did not exist in the plastic ball. We also contemplated. We were not using our physical senses to sense life. Yes, we used our eyes to look at the seed, but it was something else in us that could sense the life in the seed. That was already using a higher organ of perception, something that is to be cultivated as part of the development of this latent aspect within ourselves. And in this session, we'll dive deeper into the how of doing this, with all sorts of interesting details around our higher capacities. But before we're going there, just a bit more from Steiner explaining why this is all to take place in the physical world. Why does this take place while we're in a physical body? Quote, "Just as babies mature in their mother's womb, so the spiritual human being develops within the physical self. And just as the health of a baby depends on the normal functioning of natural laws in the mother's womb, so the health of our spiritual humanity is likewise contingent on the laws of our ordinary understanding at work in our life on earth. No one can give birth to a healthy higher self who does not live and think in a healthy manner in the physical world. Living in harmony with nature and reason is the basis of all true spiritual development. Just as a baby, while still in its mother's womb, already lives according to the forces of nature that its sense organs will perceive only after it has been born, so in physical life, the higher self already lives according to the laws of the spiritual world. And just as an unborn child, out of an obscure feeling or consciousness of life, makes use of the forces it needs, so we too can use the forces of the spiritual world before our higher self is born. Indeed, we must make use of these forces if our higher self is to enter the world as a fully developed being." End quote. The main point being said here in this long passage is that the higher self needs the rock of the material realm in order to grow. Just as the womb of the mother is where the physical embryo gestates and develops the organs it will need when it exits the womb, likewise the higher human self is in the womb of the material world, the great mothering of the material world, you could say, where it can develop the spiritual organs it will need. It's as simple as that. That's really why we are here. We are here in this temporal material world, preparing our organs for the next. And this world, this physical world with its laws, gives us that space in which the higher self can gestate and prepare to be born. Now, in speaking about the development of higher consciousness in relationship to the material realm, we have now established that the material realm is in no way antecedent to higher consciousness. But the material realm is absolutely necessary for its development. There is essential value in this realm of matter. And more than just giving us cool and useless stuff to organize around our homes. The material realm is where we are, where we came to, where we wake up in, and where the highest work can be performed. As we just heard in the quote from Steiner, the physical body in the material plane of existence is the embryonic womb of the higher self. Just as a physical body needs organs in order to function in the world in which it inhabits, so will the higher self need organs for the reality for which it inhabits and is preparing. And the really neat thing about this is that not only do we develop these higher organs here, we can use them here. One of the main things that distinguishes the work involved here from here and now, from the preparatory practices of the past, such as yoga, is that we now need to engage ourselves cognitively. This is where we're going. A path that develops our cognitive capacities is what's needed, rather than one that regards cognitive capacity as something auxiliary to our spiritual development. In fact, this new path is sometimes called cognitive yoga. And I have, in fact, a book here of that name by from Temple Lodge. Ben Aaron is the name. A little bit of a dense read, but really goes deep into the idea of the new path where our cognitive capacities are part of our spiritual path and not something auxiliary. To work on and with these capacities is our spiritual development. Cognition is a part of who we are. So just think of it logically. If spiritual development is about developing our wholeness, then it must include this growing capacity for cognition. What do I mean by cognition? Does that just mean to think? Yes and no. What is thinking? Is that just a brain activity? Is the mind just the brain, as some scientists think? The brain can play a part in thinking, and this can be measured by a scientist, but there is more going on than can be measured when thinking. We know that feeling is a part of thinking, and none of this can happen without the will also being involved in some way. So we need to return to this threefold image of the human being as a thinking, feeling, willing being, and all three being involved in cognitive activity. And therefore, all three need to be included if our spiritual work is to develop wholeness. And as we gain greater understanding of the full nature of these capacities, what is actually going on here, we might just arrive at the conclusion that our cognitive activity is already a supersensible activity. That these organs of cognition are organs of our supersensible nature, our higher self. And this higher self, in turn, is what will help us to organize these organs, to organize the material aspects of our life from a higher place. The problem people run into is when they try to organize the material realm from the level of material cognition. Material cognition is where most of the world is at, and why the organization of worldly matters is out of balance, sadly out of balance. We are out of balance and therefore throwing the world out of balance. It's that big. And we know imbalance is the prime cause of dis-ease. So we will be looking at how to develop our capacities in a truly higher way. But first, a little test to see how organized you are at this point. Think of where you live. Look around your room. Look around your home. Think of your bedroom, your kitchen, your living room. Is it organized? Has any organization been put into it at all? How is it organized? Is it both functional and aesthetic? Does it support the linear left brain and the lateral right brain? This question will be part of this session's love assignment. The outer organization is a mirror reflection of our inner organization and tells us something about our inner life, whether we're organized there, whether we're optimally using our supersensible inner organs. For example, the loft I live in here, is a bit of a crow's nest, the lofty crow's nest. Some people refer to it as I have a lot of stuff in here. I would even say I have a lot of useless stuff in here. It's called art. As Oscar Wilde once said, all art is rather useless. So it's not necessarily about having useless stuff or not. I have organized my useless stuff, my art, in a way which people quite like. They like to look at it. Every useless thing here has its place, and there's a place for every useless thing. So I'm able to organize my useless stuff. I'm quite organized, which is quite useful, especially when it comes to dealing with inner things. My skill at organization has helped me to assemble thoughts into the formulation of these 21 seminars on love, which I hope to further organize into a book someday, to go along with my other 2 books, which was the organization of a lot of thoughts, and also all the ideas that went into writing 5 full-length musicals, including the music and the lyrics, which I then organized into 15 live theater productions, and all the organization of ideas in the teaching I've done over the past 30 years. High organization has allowed me to manifest a lot. It has actually given me a lot of freedom. It has helped me to be a master of time and space to a certain degree, where I'm not only inwardly creative, but can manifest the creativity outwardly. This has given me a lot of freedom, and in some ways helped me to feel very gruntled. Because it takes inner organization to manifest outer organization. Even something as simple as setting a table or setting up chairs in a room requires some organizational ability. And this is the main difficulty for humanity at this time. We are trying to organize the material plane strictly from the level of material cognition. Material cognition. However, we need more than this so we can organize our world from a place of higher consciousness, rather than the material cognition of the lower self. The lower self is intelligent, but intelligence is not enough. Recall from 2 sessions ago on the road to freedom and the steps through sentience, intelligence, conscience. All is preparation for living with consciousness, higher consciousness of the higher self. Any civilization that seeks to guide itself strictly based on the guidance of intelligence and material cognition is doomed. It will eventually succumb to a pandemic of evil genius. To invoke Einstein on the subject, we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. We're not going to be able to manage ourselves in the material world with just material cognition. So what do we mean by material cognition? Thank you for asking. This is thinking that is based strictly on what we observe with our physical senses. This is the level modern science is at. And science has become very good at looking at the material realm with material cognition, going ever more deeply into the material realm with ever more powerful technologies that work as an extension of the physical senses' material cognition. The information derived may get conceptualized, but it is still sense-based information. This is not to judge material cognition as either good or bad. It is simply a level of cognition. To recall what we heard from Steiner earlier, for the higher self, the material realm is actually its place of embryonic development. So in fact, material scientific thinking and cognition is essential training for higher consciousness. It's not bad. It's why ancient Greek initiates, like Pythagoras and Plato, had students focus on the laws of the physical realm, working with meditations on the Platonic solids and so forth. It grounded their cognitive capacities in absolute laws. So let's look at the key elements involved in material cognition. We're looking at, first of all, the levels of cognition. And this is based on ideas of Rudolf Steiner in his book called Stages of Higher Knowledge, which is in fact the sequel to the book How to Know Higher Worlds. All right, so we'll take a quick look here at the levels of cognition. Material cognition, imaginational cognition, inspirational cognition, and intuitional cognition. That's where we're going to go. But let's look at this elements of cognition. And starting from the bottom and moving up. First thing is the object, which makes an impression on our senses, such as at the beginning meditation, you observed objects in the room around you, and this made an impression on your senses. The second element of cognition is the image, a representation which a human forms of the object. So in the opening meditation, I had you close your eyes and have just the image of the object within your mind's eye. The image was not the object, it was just a representation which you formed of the object. And then the third element of cognition is the concept or the idea through which the human arrives at a knowing of the object. So you have the object and then the image of it, and then you have the idea or the concept around this object. And then the fourth element of cognition is the I, the you, which forms for itself an image and concept based on the impression of the object. So, for example, if I were to pick up a pen, I have this object, it makes an impression on my senses. It's something in the outer realm that makes an impression. And then I form an image. I make some sort of representation of it in my mind. So I put the pen down. I'm not looking at it. I can have my eyes closed or I can have my eyes open. But I form an image, a memory of this pen. Although I don't call it a pen necessarily at first. That's the third step. The third element is where I form a concept or an idea that, oh, this is a pen I'm holding. This is a pen I'm thinking about, a pen used for writing. And then fourthly, the fourth element is this activity is done by me. This is something I do as an ego being. This is the sort of activity that we're engaged in all the time. But in order to move beyond the sense-bound material cognition, which is so pervasive and keeps us at a material level, one then has to learn how to work without the first element, to not have a physical object involved. In material cognition, the object is the source of the impression, and we receive it and we perceive it. As long as we're looking at the object, we're dealing with the thing itself. But the moment we look away or close our eyes, we're left only with the image, the second element. The object is relinquished, while the image is retained in memory. But we don't stop there. We don't stop at the image-making step. A distinction is made between the image and the concept, which is more activity of the I. The I derives an idea or a concept out of the image. An example that Steiner gives is that I see a circular form. I then turn away, but retain a picture of the circular form. So far, the I has not formulated the concept of the circle. It's just an image in mind. I make the next step when I say, A circle is a figure in which all points are equidistant from the center. A concept has been formulated. An understanding of a thing is only attained when we form a concept of it. There are many sizes of circles, but only one concept of a circle. And making this connection between an image and concept is the work of the fourth element, the I ego. What would be the case if there was no ego activity? You'd just be standing there staring blankly at a circle, just looking at this thing, but you would not be active and you would not formulate an idea concept around it. And this is critical in understanding the nature of our inner life. The I ego stores an image in memory where it can make connections to other images, other perceptions, and concepts. The second element, the image stored in memory, is an important basis for the fourth element, for the I ego to do its activity. And the same thing can be said of the material object itself. The I ego needs it as a basis of egoic activity, at least at the level of material cognition. We need that object, physical object, as a starting point. But once it has the image in mind, it can just work with the image. It no longer needs the material object for its activity. Then it is just the second, third, and fourth elements involved: image, concept, and the I. But thinking of the image, what would it be like if the image of an object was stored in memory only as long as the object itself is present? I'll say that again. What would it be like if the image of an object was stored in memory only as long as the object itself was present? Because of the continuity necessary in our inner life, the I has access to other things inside to build understanding with, regardless of whether the initial object that made the impression is present or not. So we can maintain these images even after the object is not there. And this way, the I ego combines its concepts and thereby develops an understanding of the world. And so goes the material mode of cognition, working with all four elements: receiving an impression or sensation of an object as an image, a representation of the outer world, then working with the perception to develop concepts. So to bring that up one more time here. So at the bottom there's the object, which makes an impression on the senses. Then an image, representation, which the human forms of the object. Then the concept, through which the human arrives at a knowing of the object. And then the I, which is the thing that's doing this, forms for itself an image and concept based on impression of object. Now at the next stage of knowledge, there is no outer object making an impression on the senses. There's no sensation. The first of the elements, the sensation, falls away. There are only three elements involved: just an image, the concept, and the activity of the I. It is we who forms the image, our inner representation of an object. In the first step, an object gives us the impression, and we have a perception which leads to a concept. At the second level of cognition, known as imaginational cognition, there is no object. So the I has to work without an external object as catalyst for forming a concept. To work at this level, the I has to acquire and develop the faculty of forming images without the stimulus of external sensory objects. Something else must take the place of outer objects. we must be able to form images without a sensory stimulus. Steiner refers to this as capital I imagination. The word imagination spelled with a capital I to distinguish it from how we use the word imagination in ordinary use. At this stage, images appear in exactly the same way as if a sensory object were making an impression, and the images are as vivid and true as any sensory image, but are not of an outer origin. They are of an inner origin. At this stage, our access to interactivity and understanding is not confined to what reaches us through the senses with material cognition. So with this imaginational cognition, the door opens to a world of images received from a different source. We could perhaps even say a higher source. And this is what we did in the opening meditation. You first used material cognition, looking around the room at objects, and then you closed your eyes and you went to work as an eye, forming an image of what you saw, and then perhaps derive some ideas and concepts around that. At the end of the meditation, the last part of the meditation, you had the eyes closed and you weren't accessing an outer image. You were creating an image that had no external reference point. You were creating your own room, your own palace, your own space, and filling it with the objects that you wanted to have there, that made you feel good. That was working with imaginational cognition. Of course, objections may be raised that imaginational cognition only leads to a realm of fantasy and illusion, just blowing bubbles at your neck. People are so acclimated thinking that the only things that are real are things that have a basis in sensory evidence. And of course, it is entirely possible and happens quite frequently that people do fall into error over images they see inside, not knowing how to interpret these images. But this just points again to the importance of why the material realm is our starting point. The tangible realm is our starting point, the embryonic environment, and our training ground for the development of higher consciousness. This is where we can acquire a keen sciencey sense for what is true and what is erroneous. The physical realm, in a sense, gives us something to fall back on, to guard us from being swept away in a sea of speculative images. With the starting point of material cognition, we can approach with greater confidence this next stage of cognition, imaginational cognition, where we seek to access information without the support of the material realm, higher knowledge. And of course, this confidence also comes with experience in working with this next mode of cognition, and also points to the role of a guide and teacher in the pursuit of this development. This is actually the sort of practice that was taught in the old mystery schools, in the esoteric training centers, but now needs to become more commonplace and part of our mainstream science. Why? So people are no longer destroyed for lack of knowledge, lack of the right knowledge, which can only come with the right kind of cognitive activity. Levels of cognition. So, right, we started at the bottom, number 1, material cognition, working with outer objects, and then imaginational cognition based on an inner image. We're moving to inspirational cognition based on inner word or inner hearing. And then lastly, we'll get to intuitional cognition based on being in the object. So at this third level of cognition, what happens? Images no longer appear. It is now just about the concept, the idea, and the I, the third and fourth elements. There is no image, no memories generated from impressions of an object, nothing borne over from the outer world. It is just you and the it of whatever it is that's in the space. And actually, when there is no image that stands between you and the itness can approach you more directly and pour inspiration into you to reveal itself from behind and beyond the image realm of the imaginational level, the realm of appearances. We're now working on another level of cognition. And what we can access at this level of cognition is literally beyond anything of the material world and what material cognition can provide. This level is what Steiner refers to as capital I inspiration. The impressions come from internal inspirations, and the I works to form the concepts and ideas from that. If anything in the sensory realm can be compared with this level of inspiration, it is the sense of hearing, the hearing of the inner word. With this power, while listening to something externally, we can hear and perceive what is actually going on at the heart of the matter, inwardly. The true nature of things becomes revealed in what some call a type of spiritual hearing. When inspired with a capital I, inspired, one perceives the inner nature of things. It is like a language of another world that speaks to us, that actually makes this everyday world more comprehensible. In order for this level of cognition to take place, for an inspiration to take place, or as I like to call it, an in-spirit action, there is a literal conception that takes place. An impregnation of an idea is taking place in a higher form of the self. I'm going to read a quote from Rudolf Steiner. In the true sense of the word, we must discover the higher self. We must resolve at every moment to listen to the inspiration of the Spirit in all things. I'll repeat that last part. We must resolve at every moment to listen to the inspiration of the Spirit in all things. This is inspirational cognition. Moving to the fourth level of knowledge, known as intuitional cognition. Inspiration ceases, and so does the third element, the concept. What does that leave us with? The element of the egoic I is left alone in the experience of knowing. And this experience of knowing has a distinct character. The I no longer stands outside the itness of what it observes. Rather, it has a sense of being in it, of being within it. Or better, it has a supersensible sense of being within it. There is no material object, no representational image, no inspirational pouring in of an idea or concept. Instead, there is a complete identification of the I with the it, with whatever it is the I is engaged with. Something comes to life within the inner life of the ego, where what it lives with is the reality of the object itself. object and subject are one for that moment of inquiry. The I has fully embraced and merged with it. And this level of cognition is called intuition with a capital I. At this stage of knowledge, we become capable of true intuitive knowing. Not just a gut feeling, as intuition is ordinarily thought of, but a merging between subject and object. A merging where the two penetrate each other. An intercourse between the two, which leads to the birth of an intuition, a true knowing. Just as Adam knew Eve and gave birth to Cain, we can know, have cognitive intercourse with something, have a conception which leads to the birth of an idea. This is true intuitional activity. An interesting point made by Steiner is that in our ordinary experience, the prime intuition we have is that of the I itself. If intuition is about a full merging with something and living within it as it lives within us, it is only the I that lives within us that we are fully merged with. The I can in no way be perceived externally. It is experienced only in the inner life, the place where intuition takes place. This is an important fact, so let's take a moment to unpack it a bit further. In ordinary life, we can all call something in the outer world by the same name. We all call a chair, an acorn, the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister. But there's only one word which each of us can apply to ourselves. That is the word I. I. No other person can call me I. Only I can call myself I, because I live within the I. I am merged with it. Anyone else would refer to me as you. Likewise, everyone else to me is you. Only I say I of myself. And this is because each person lives not outside of themselves, but within the I. Similarly, in intuitive cognition, one lives in the other thing. The I, for the period it is connecting with something, the itness of it, other than itself, lives within the other. We live within the other for that moment, just as the I ordinary lives within itself as an I. And what this means is that, as Dr. Steiner puts it, the perception of our I is the prototype of all intuitive cognition. The perception of the I, my I and your I, is the prototype of all other true knowing. And to be able to enter into truly knowing anything else, we must then step outside of the self. To be able to enter into true knowing of anything else other than our I, we must be able to step outside of the I. We must become selfless in order to merge with something else, with something other than ourself. The I has to stand alone as the only element in cognition, the fourth element in cognition. No object, no image, no concept, nothing between the I and the essential spiritual beingness of whatever it is seeking to know. This links to another concept. This capacity for selflessness may be linked to the concept of empathy. Empathy means to be able to feel what the other feels, have an experience of what the other experiences, to know for yourself what the beingness of the other is really all about. Empathy. And this capacity for empathy is what we need at this level of cognition so that the subjectivity of our experience is not colored by our sympathies and antipathies. Sympathies and antipathies. This is the things that we like and we don't like, which means if we're living in our sympathies and antipathies, we see only what we want to see and not what is really there. Our subjectivity is distorted by our sympathies and antipathies, which often controls us. So we are not free when we just live in the pull of our sympathies and antipathies, our likes and dislikes, what attracts us and what repels us. We're not free if we're governed by these things. In fact, we become slaves to them. They color our judgment with prejudices of ways of looking at things. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. But when we develop empathy, our subjectivity is able to be more objective. This is what I like to call the supreme pinnacle of objective subjectivity. We've risen above our sympathies and antipathies, our prejudices, and we can have a more objective subjectivity. In this way, through a development of empathy, the lower self learns to avail itself more to the higher self, the cognition and the capacities of the higher self. We're not blocking it. We're transcending the lower self. And therefore, we don't get lost on the slippery slope of higher consciousness. It is a slippery slope. This capacity for empathy allows for what I mentioned earlier, where we can connect our will with the will of the Spirit. We connect our will with the will of the Spirit. Now, the title of this session is Grow Your Own I, Grow Your Own High. And it's showing how when we work with specific practices, which requires engaging our will, which is required for growing our own I, we will engage in growing our own high, the high of the higher self. Whereas in the past, the preparatory practices, much of our will work was done for us. For example, via the energy of the Guru giving us Shaktipat, or the use of substances that induced us into a higher state of consciousness. And that was appropriate in the preparatory stages of evolution, as were external moral codes that guided the will, which we'll learn about in the next session, entitled Leading with Love. But at this point in our evolution, we need to engage and upgrade the cognitive capacities of our threefold thinking, feeling, and will, so we can soar to the heights based on their powers and via the spiritualized imagination, inspiration, and intuition, all spelled with a capital I. I. All empowering the I. The I am self-aware ego, spelled with a capital E. And hopefully you are seeing more clearly how and why love is an element in knowledge. Without love, true love, a higher form of love, selfless love, there can be no true knowing. Truth will always be concealed by a veil of our own making, the veil of the lower self, when we're being not selfless and being egocentric. But when working at unpacking the seed of your higher self in the ways indicated, then the veil will part in accord with your own unveiling of yourself, which is why the adage of the ancient Greek mystery schools was know thyself. Know thyself. One has to know thyself in order to be able to part the veil of the lower self. And of course, this all has to be done out of your
freedom of will.
Freedom of will. Archangel Michael knows very well and respects our freedom of will. Now, when speaking of the higher consciousness or the higher self, we need to make reference to why this is sometimes referred to as the Christ consciousness. The Christ consciousness. Have you ever wondered that? If you've ever seen reference to this in your own seeking? It's simple. As you've seen in Steiner's references, the idea of the higher self as a seed is quite literal. It is a seed buried, concealed, under shrink wrap, you could say, in the human psyche. One might ask, where did this potential for higher self, a new and higher nature, come from? Where does this idea fit in the model of an evolutionary biologist, for example? Well, it doesn't. Science as it sits now will never be able to explain this phenomenon of higher consciousness, supposedly coming from a higher self. But you can experience it yourself phenomenologically if you work with the prescribed way, these levels of cognition. The seed of the higher self is supersensible. And logically speaking, as with any seed, the seed is only available after it has been planted. So where in the course of evolution, during the stages of evolution of consciousness, which are also played out and recapitulated, you could say, every time a human being is born and develops, where did the seed of the higher self enter the realm of possibilities? Well, the early stages of development were preparation for its coming, this coming seed. So at what stage does the real potential for consciousness become available, and where did it come from? Did it grow out of a rock or evolve out of a shrew, as current science states? As we saw in the chart of the human biography, the potential first becomes available when the ego enters what has been prepared. Because the ego is the bearer of consciousness, along with love. Until it has landed within the prepared body, the potential for true higher consciousness is simply not there. So, this image of the human biography that we looked at 2 sessions back is a micro picture of what has happened macrocosmically in Earth's evolution. And at one point in time, a very definite singular event, the Earth received the seed potential of human ego and all that that represents. The Earth had been prepared as a garden, ready to receive the seed of the ego. This moment in time, this turning point in time, where a new seed of potential entered the Earth garden to grow and flourish as ego consciousness, is what is traditionally told of in the stories and legends of the entrance of the Holy Spirit dove, symbolic of a new higher nature entering the body of the man Jesus. That's right, Jesus. Without getting caught in the religiosity of these stories and legends or debating the theology of ancient parchments, we can circumvent this by simply considering that this was strictly an evolutionary event. An event where the Earth, as an egg, and the Earth truly has the properties of fertility of an egg, received a conception, received a seed. And this conception of a seed took place initially through one person, so that it could then ultimately be made available to all people. And the name of this person is not as important as the event itself, where through this organism of one person who is referred to by many names: Yeshua, Jeshua, Jeshu, Jesus, Emmanuel, and also the Christ, which I'll explain in a moment. But in a generic way, this person is also referred to in the Bible as the Son of Man and the Son of God, which points to the duality of its origins. Son of Man, Son of God, points to the duality of its origins. The word son literally means born of. So it's actually gender neutral, or truly transgender when we speak of son of. Because the higher self is also transgender or genderless. And the aspect that impregnated the earth through the man Jesus, when he took the baptism of the Spirit, is what is referred to as the Christ, which was the non-earthly half of the duality. Christ, literally, the word means the one, or the anointed one. In an earthly sense, this means the one anointed with oil. But the name Christ was more so pointing to a new anointing, how the earth was being anointed with a new and higher nature through the seed, the potential of a higher self with higher consciousness, which humanity had been prepared to receive and eventually bring to bloom. This is all part of the plan, plant, planet. And as an aside, I just mentioned that this word Christ actually comes from the Egyptian word Christ, which is in English spelled with K-R-S-T, Christ, which refers to a body anointed and mummified, which originally derives its name from the part of Egypt where this practice was primarily done. And just as the word alchemy, al-chem, refers to the mineral-rich area of Egypt where the early days of chemistry were practiced, so the word Christ refers to the area of Egypt where the practice of anointing and mummification of a body to preserve it was also practiced. And this is not uncommon for a name to be based on a geographical location. And so this Christ conception is really where the potential of a higher self first became part of the Earth's evolution. A literal supersensible seed was planted, which can be perceived when you develop your supersensible powers. This was planted through one human so that it would then become available to all humans. And the amazing thing about this is that this is not dissimilar to how a virus spreads, but in this case with a reverse intention. A virus carries a seed code that then works with the inherent code of an individual, which then becomes a part of their makeup and then replicates and spreads by invisible means to other organisms. Likewise, this perspective of the Christ, as I'm sharing, is like a seed code of a new nature, a higher self, and is intended to spread through the human species, or at least to those who say yes to it through
freedom of will.
Freedom of will. And this is not just something I've made up, this whole perspective of things. This is part of the perspective of Rudolf Steiner, who, as you know, is the person who wrote the manual on supersensible perception. So you can imagine he had supersensible perception of these things and was able to have intimate phenomenological knowledge of these matters around the conception of this seed through the Christ. So, and to give this an even greater context, the idea of the Christ, the one, or the one that the ancestors were waiting for, or the one as the unifying principle was referred to by the Greek initiates as the Logos. The Logos. Logos is sometimes translated from Greek into English as the Word. And the Word, we know, is a medium of a message. And so is a logo. A logo. We have logos everywhere these days. Symbols, emojis, symbolic mediums that are a representation of all that stands behind the logo. So it's what's behind the logos, behind the word. The logo organizes the whole idea into one concise logo. We also get the word logic from this word logos. Everything is logically and creatively coded, ordered, and organized into this seed, logos, the creative word, the original vibration, you could say, the original inspiration of creation of the cosmos that created us. And this is really the best way to think of what this Christ seed is about. It is a packed principle that, when unpacked, has the power to organize everything else. It is the one unifying principle. This is why we can say, as I did last session, when you take care of the eye takes care of everything else. The I, ego, its function is to organize and bring order to everything else. And when the I, ego, grows up into this higher self, cultivates the seed of the higher self brought by the one, the Christ, the unifying principle of everything, then it will bring organization to our material world through the material cognition, which is informed by higher levels of cognition, the imaginational cognition, the inspirational cognition, and ultimately the intuitional cognition, where the I is merged completely with everything else. And this is not just the mechanical organizing of things, because this is a living presence within ourselves, a living presence within ourselves, this higher self that guides us in a living, organical way. And I'll talk more about this in the next session, as I mentioned, entitled Leading with Love, which will look at leaders of humanity, such as the Christ and other leaders, who are part of the process of preparing humanity to receive the seed of the new nature, and also people whose work it is to unpack this seed potential, actively working out of this impulse of the Christ consciousness as a new consciousness that was prepared for in the older consciousness. And through this, we can all rise in a new breathing, living, breathing cognition of the higher self. As I said in the previous session, and we'll say again, if you got rid of all the techniques, trappings, the outer stuff, and spiritual practices, and boil it all back to one thing, what is the key? The activity of the I. The activity of the I. The I am. This is the key point that distinguishes the older mysteries and practices from the new mysteries. And this is all we have at the fourth and highest stage of knowledge, intuitional cognition. And it is in growing the new organs for the I in the way specified, we can grow our own I and grow our own high, the real high for the I. So to finish off this session and prepare for the next, Leading with Love, what needs to be emphasized is the centrality of love in all of this. There can be no true knowing without love. There can be no true knowing without the selflessness of true love. Remember, perfected, purified, purified love from the first series. Now we can see this higher love is not just a nice notion, but an absolute essential requirement for humanity to evolve in the right way, based on the right access and application of knowledge. In fact, it's so essential, it's a deal breaker for the cosmos that created us when it comes to true knowing, to have love. When real knowledge is really a revelation from the cosmos itself. Oh yes, we can extract information out of things, which modern science has become exceedingly good at. But real information, what I like to call holy knowing, that can be used in a whole and balanced manner and is ultimately a matter of revelation to those who prepare themselves in a specific way with love. And we're not just talking about Sunday lovers, but love that informs your character in everything you do. And when you're there, you can truly call yourself a son of God, a son of man. What is born of the heights and born into the depths, which is, to be in a word, born again. So, this session 5, grow your own I, grow your own high. You're going to repeat the meditation we did at the beginning, where you practice looking around your room, having a good look at the objects, and then closing your eyes and remembering what you saw, and see how much detail you can recall. And just practice that over and over to develop this capacity for mental picturing, which is so important and really has been lost in our modern lifestyle, where we spend so much time looking at pre-made images, through movies and whatnot. So I'm pasting that one into the chat. Yeah, just looking at things, then closing your eyes and reimagining it. And then the second one is around being organized. To organize your outer realm from your inner realm. So you can even do this right after the first exercise, where you look around your room and close your eyes and remember what's there, and see if additional information, images, inspirations, intuitions come into your mind that reveal you something about your place. It's like, oh, I close my eyes and all of a sudden I realize the sense that that chair shouldn't be there, or that mirror should be moved, or that wall needs some art. That this comes from an inner intuition or inspiration. So, yeah, and get a sense of whether your outer environment is not organized. It's not organized to the degree that it could be. And this is reflecting something of your inner realm, that it lacks some organization that ultimately comes from the higher self. And I also put here that this organization is also about priorities. And do we bring consciousness to establishing priorities in our life, which can easily get squashed by other things? Do we organize our time as well as our space into priorities? Or do we let things slip to a lower priority and therefore we suffer? We don't get things done that we would really like to prioritize. So I'll post that second one there. Boom. And then we've got the third one, which is to practice the 4 levels of cognition: material, imaginational, inspirational, intuitional. And be aware what the 4 elements are: object, image, concept, idea, and then the I. And see how selflessness at the highest level, the intuitional level, allows you to really develop a super sensible connection and knowing to something. So, yeah, this is kind of the real core of tonight, would be to practice, become more aware of the different levels and the different elements. And then last but not least, can anybody guess what the 4th one's going to be?
Higher self-love.
Well,
Rickshaw.
the Ruckshaw. You got it. The Ruckshaw. To do it every day, towards the end of the day, for the rest of your life. I love my Ruckshaw. Do my Ruckshaw, then I give myself a little treat with a little spoonful of honey and ghee before going to bed.